Kenneth Schubring. I go by Ken. I was born on June 28th, 1922, in Manistee, Michigan. I had a brother and three sisters. I'm the eldest. My grandparents on my dad's side emigrated from Germany. My mother and her mother with her emigrated from Finland, but they are Swedes. Actually, they're Swede Finns. Their language and environment around them was all Swedish. So, but they were actually born in Finland. So that's both sides of my relation. They were mostly farmers, agricultural. I was born and raised on a dairy farm, which was part of their business, of course. I only remained on that farm until I was ready to follow my dad, who changed employment to a nearby town, and continued with the rest of my home life at that place, Manistee. I was raised on a farm, though, born and raised on a farm until I was in the second grade. By that time, I was living in the little town that I talked about, Manistee. And my dad was a mechanic, and fortunately was, from an economic standpoint, why our family didn't suffer much from the Depression, because my dad always had a job and we were always okay, in other words, during that time. But we could see the environment around us and the impact of the Depression, and it was pretty bad.
When did you decide to join the military?
Well, I decided in late 1940, so I went into the military. I enlisted in the Air Force in December 10th of 1940, and I enlisted for Hawaii, which is where I ended up, of course. I just graduated from high school, as I said. I was 18.
What influenced your decision?
Well, actually, it was a tale of the times, if you want to put it that way. Europe had been at war for well over a year in 1939. I graduated in 1940, and the Selective Service Act was also in effect in drafting people, in other words, during that same time. And the tone of the times just seemed to say that sooner or later, rather sooner than later, I would probably have to make this decision again anyway. And I always had wanted to, I had an interest in aviation, read it a lot, etc., that type of thing. Being a young fellow, I followed a lot of the hero worship of the Lafayette Escadrille and Eddie Reckenbacker, and so on, and Baron von Richthofen of Germany. It was easy to fall in love with the subject.
So where did your initial training take place?
My initial training took place at Jefferson Barracks, St. Louis, Missouri, right on the Mississippi. And I was about 18 on December 10th of 1940. That's when I reached Jefferson Barracks the next day after December 10th.
Was that your first time being away from home and your family?
For the most part, I would say yes. I had traveled some, but for the most part, I'd say that would be a pretty accurate statement. Basic training was basic training. You were introduced to the Army and the way of life, what they expected of you, traditions, etc. And at the same time, the basic training involved classification, in other words, deciding what they were going to do with you and what kind of work you were going to do and that type of thing. I went to a technical school afterwards as a result. I finished technical training at Lowry Field, Denver, Colorado, mechanic training there in May, almost June of 1941. I was in June of 1941 was assigned to Hawaii. I did it by the way of Fort McDowell in San Francisco, California. Sailed from San Francisco in the middle of June of 1941, arrived there 2 weeks, joined, and was assigned to a pursuit squadron, the 6th Pursuit Squadron, 18th Pursuit Group, which is a fight where, in today's language, it would be a fighter squadron, fighter airplanes, single engine. Yeah, Wheeler Field was an old Army airfield. I think it probably dated back to the 20s. And it was named after an Air Force officer that had been at that field, and Sheldon Wheeler. It had a grass runway because that would accommodate single engine airplanes. It didn't need these hard cement runways, although the tarmacs around the hangars that housed the airplanes were cement. But it was a pretty primitive airport at that particular time. I could tell you later on, I went back and after the war and found out that the airfield had been turned over to a helicopter group in the Army. So a lot of helicopter training took place after World War II. But that's another story.
Can you describe what your role was and what some of your responsibilities were?
The role was an airplane mechanic, but I was on the regular roster of the squadron, just like anyone else was concerned as far as duties are concerned. Let me explain that a little bit. I regularly did my job on whatever airplane I was assigned to, crew I was assigned to. But there were regular duties that only enlisted men, not non-commissioned officers, they were exempt from, that would be done by an enlisted man. And one of them was guard duty. And that has a very, very big impact on what you're talking about to me today, because I was on guard duty on the evening before and of December 7th, 1941. And I was guarding airplanes because of a policy that the Air Force had that was made in Washington and Hawaii, that the fear of the people that operated, who were in charge of the operations, thought, and that was that the islands wouldn't be very susceptible to an air attack from the outside. That instead, the biggest danger to Hawaii would have been sabotage from the inside. And so there was a certain stint of guard duty periodically that was assigned to enlisted men to walk with a rifle and make sure that nobody was in the area around operating around the planes because of sabotage. And the airplanes were parked on tarmacs, cement tarmacs that surrounded the hangars that they were housed in when they were being worked on. There wasn't any fear, but because nobody could conceive of anybody doing anything like that and coming out alive. I didn't detect any, at least, but everybody was apprehensive of the times that we were living in then, because, as I said, the war was in England. I was able to sit out and follow by radio the Battle of Britain, which was in the summer of 1940. So a lot was taking place. Poland had been invaded, and the Russians, on the time that I was on the boat going over to Hawaii, the Russians had been invaded by Germany. So there was a lot going on at the time, and it would be perfectly natural for everybody to be a little bit apprehensive, because every crisis that it would come up would mean another reason that the person would be that closer to being in a war situation. I felt it was approaching because I read the newspapers, and the newspapers were pretty much full of what was going on in the world. And among the things going on in the world was a lot of Japanese troop movement toward the Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, in that area. So there was reason to be suspicious that something might be up. And so most of us followed current events fairly well. We lived in an area where there was a lot of communications, two good radio stations, two good newspapers, that type of thing.
How prepared do you feel at Wheeler Airfield?
Never really sensed, never thought about what it would take to be prepared, to tell you the truth. But I knew, looking back on it, talking about training, that we had a minimum of training because nobody believed an attack would take place. I don't think there was anybody that really was preparing for it to take place. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, I was doing a stint of guard duty, which involved 2 days on guard duty and 2 days off guard duty. And on one of the 2 days on guard duty, you'd be walking a pattern around the airplanes to make sure that there were no saboteurs there. And then the other one, you'd have a rest period of 4 hours. It was 4 hours on and 4 hours off. I was in the 6th Pursuit Squadron, 18th Pursuit Group. It's commonly called the Hawaiian Air Force, incidentally.
You were off duty at the time of the attack, though, correct?
Yeah, well, what happened was I was due to be dismissed from my part of the stint of guard duty at 7 in the morning, which meant that I was through with guard duty until I would have to go back on after another 4 hours that had elapsed after I left. So I was prepared to go back at 7 o'clock on the morning of December 7th, back to my barracks to wash up, which I did, and then go to the mess hall where we all ate. Breakfast was being served at around 8 o'clock. And I remember joshing with some of my fellow airmen about, well, it's 8 o'clock, it's about time to eat or something like that. I remember looking at my watch, it was around 8. At that time, that's when the attack began. And we received it at Wheeler Field in the form of an explosion of a nearby building that was blown up by a Japanese airplane. But let me get back to the important part of that. That is when the attack began, right? We heard an explosion. And of course, naturally, an explosion on a Sunday morning would be a very, very unusual thing. The next thing that most reasonable people would have done, and which we did, was to all go outside to see what happened, because the explosion was outside. It wasn't in our barracks. It was a place that was near an airplane hangar. It was a supply building, and it was blown up, and it had flammable chemicals in it. So it started to burn, and then let off a lot of dark smoke, which occluded the area. From that time on, it was a case of, what are you going to do with yourself? And in my particular case, I just looked for a flat place on the ground outside the barracks, because the sky was full of airplanes. I would just simply say it was just lousy with them. It turns out there probably would have been about 35 or 40 airplanes, at least, just from post-war accounts of that I'd read. And they were Aichi dive bombers. They were bombing the hangar area and the barracks areas and so on and so forth. So I immediately hit the ground and fell on my belly and crawled to a nearby place where there was a ditch. And I crawled into the ditch, which would have been about as low a place as you could dive into. There'd been a little water in it, so it got pretty well doused because it had rained, and it was later going to rain that day too. It had rained quite a bit before then. So that's where I initially protected myself. And once the Japanese airplanes of that particular wave disappeared, I looked for a better place to be protected. And there was a rise in the area that I was, a rise in the ground to an area where there was some non-commissioned housing. I finally crawled up to the place where they had the basement brick entrance bricked in. And I thought that'd be a convenient place because the second wave had arrived after that was over with, and they strafed the area, which meant, of course, they were shooting from the airplanes into the area to clean up whatever part of the mess was left. And they were there for about a half hour. It was a half hour each way. And at the end of that half hour, what I did was I made my way back to the barracks area to find out, what the next move was going to be or where I was needed next. And that was the end of the attack. We could see in the distance Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field, which are right across the road from each other. And that there was smoke, black smoke billowing all the way up, just a very, very occluded sky all the way to Pearl Harbor. So we knew that there was some damage being done down there at Hickam Field and Pearl Harbor, which turned out, of course, obviously to be the case. What stood out was that anybody that had to go from here to there, in other words, wherever they were trying to protect themselves, and then like I was trying later to get down to my area, to get to that area, you had to walk through an opening in the pattern of buildings in the area to your barracks building where all the people I assumed would be congregated, and I'd find out what was going on. But on your way there, well, you'd see part of what happened, and I could determine that the hangar was completely destroyed. All of our airplanes were completely destroyed, and that a lot of the carnage was visible, including a lot of badly mutilated bodies and stuff like that. It was a good introduction to the ways of war. Wasn't much. It wasn't destroyed, except some of the buildings that were just in the way, at the time. But the Japanese destroyed what they wanted to destroy, obviously. A lot of people ask the question, where did these Japanese actually come from? You two understand the geography of northern Oahu, of course. The airplane carriers that they had, and there were 6 carriers, plus about 20 some odd supply ships, battleships, cruisers, tankers, anything like that. They had made their way through the North Pacific after leaving their anchorage in late November of 1941. And they made their way through the North Pacific to a place off Haleiwa, would be, if you're familiar with that, on the north coast of Oahu. That's where they stored their attack, where they assembled their attack, and where the airplanes took off from. And they had to pass Wheeler Field. And later war accounts proved that, because they bombed us, actually probably before they bombed Pearl, because they were on their way. If you can just imagine the geography of the place, the Waianae Range and the Kula Range, they came right down the middle to get to Pearl Harbor. And Wheeler Field was right within their grasp.
So you went on to serve throughout the duration of World War II. Where did your service take you after Pearl Harbor?
First of all, I applied for the aviation cadet program in mid-1941, after the Pearl Harbor attack, in other words, in the summer, and had to wait for transportation to get back to the United States. But I was assigned, I went into aviation cadet training in 1942. It was December of 42 when I finally got back. And in August of 42, not 41, I applied for cadet status. Anyway, that would take me back to Southern California in around New Year's Day of 1942. Went back in a convoy, which included the airplane, the ship that I can't went back on. The President Cleveland was the name of the ship. The name of the ship I went over on, by the way, was Sent Hill, name of a famous battle in World War I.
Did your experiences at Pearl Harbor shape how you approached the rest of the war?
Not much, because I was made aware that the war, the one thing that the Pearl Harbor attack did was it brought us into the war, and it made you realize you were in a war, and that everything that happened to you from that point on was going to be predicated by what happened in that war. In other words, where the Japanese went or where the Germans went or whatever they did. And so to that extent, the reality that we were in a war was the important thing that I learned from the Pearl Harbor attack, other than the fact that you should have been much better prepared, which is kind of a non-brainer.
Did you listen to FDR's speech the next day?
No, but we quickly heard excerpts from it on KGMB and KGU, which were the two radio stations in Honolulu at that time. So many times heard it. They ran it a good many times. And it was done probably for motivational purposes for the troops.
Back to the end of the war, you mentioned at the beginning of this that you were actually in a combat mission. How did you hear the war was over?
I'd like to start a little earlier than that, if I could. I went back and I finished, and I went through training in the B-29 program. B-29 was just started from scratch by a general named Wolf. General Wolf ran the introduction of the B-29 to the Air Force. It was a very, very long project. I went through it in various airfields in the United States. We were formed in the battle units and went overseas that way. In other words, flew over and lived over there and flew over there is in units to bomb Japan. So that's how it started. That began in, we left for Japan in the late fall, November of 1944. And I remained there until the end of the war, which would have been the fall, September, October of 1945. And in that span of time, I flew 35 bombing missions as a flight engineer on the B-29s. And typical B-29 mission was 14 hours in the air. From a mileage standpoint, it was 750 miles up to Iwo Jima. We'd have to fly over or past that. That was halfway to Japan to bomb the various places we bombed there. We flew our bombing missions between the fall of November of 1944, between that and the end of the war. During that time, we did all sorts of different types of bombing. One would be formation bombing, where you bomb a specific strategic target. That was where groups of planes would gather together to protect themselves with a gunnery on their planes, and then carry out their bombing mission, drop their bombs, and go back home. And then there was another type of bombing mission where we went in individually to a specific target just to burn it out, which were firebomb missions. I'd say that the mix was about half and half, let's say, of both. And then as far as where I learned the end of the war, and I'll enter into the conversation, because General LeMay, who was our commanding officer, did not want to take his foot off the pedal. Wanted to keep bombing Japan till they gave up. And that was hard for them to do because they couldn't face to say, we give up, which they later did. But I mean, it was a long process. We finished a mission to Osaka. We bombed Osaka at noon, and I think it was August 15th or something like that. And we were on our return trip, of course, back to Saipan from Osaka, outside of Osaka, 2 hours outside of Osaka. And we're listening to Armed Forces Radio, which we always did because they had the best coverage of news and things like that, having lived on Saipan at that time. Why, of course, there was no daily newspaper and stuff like that. So we depend upon radio, the Armed Forces Radio. Over the radio, it came to be that Hirohito was pretty upset by the bombing that had taken place, just as a matter of normal bombing, the type that we did, the fire bombing and the strategic bombing. But he was even more disturbed because on the 8th of August, before the time that we were in the air, the 15th of August, after bombing Osaka, why, of course, Hiroshima had been bombed, and they were very upset. And I think their minds were being made up at that time to get out of the war. So it wasn't a great surprise to find out over the Armed Forces Radio that Hirohito had requested an armistice. That became news. And of course, we were listening to it when it came over the intercom on our airplane. And we all had a good time rejoicing over the end of the war. Made our way back to Saipan to continue the celebration.
Celebration wasn't like the New York City,
No, we didn't have the proper staffing for that. There were no women to be picked up and kissed. No, I did have a bottle of Southern Comfort that I'd saved for a long time to pass around to the crowd, and I did, and I didn't see much of it myself.
Can you tell us a little bit about your post-war career?
Well, I always wanted to go to the University of Michigan to begin with, and that was number one in my post-war plans. And actually, what I did is to get admitted to finishing up, getting my, credentials there. So that was the first thing. Of course, then it was a matter of course making a living. And after I'd graduated, several years afterward, I graduated and had gotten married, and then my family came along. I was assigned to several different locations. I changed jobs a couple of 3 times. So I had Athens was one of them, because, and one of them I'd like to talk about, because I was with General Time Company there, and I was roughly 20 years. And my children went to school there, kind of grew up there. So it was a key location in my life. And while I was in Athens, of course, I was in a lot of civic activities. I was in, like both of my children, in the Rotary Club of Athens. And they were in the Rotary Clubs in their respective locations. And also I was a member of the school board for 6 years, which would be 2 terms. And I was president of the board, vice president in 1971 and 72. And that was the first 2 years, then 6 years. And 2 years at the end of the term, I was president. And that was during the key years when the schools were integrated in very, very difficult assignment. And it's a lot that goes into integrating a school system, changing names of schools and whatnot, and assignments of teachers and curricula and blah, blah, blah. You can name it, and it's probably a crisis. I was the president, chief executive officer of the school board then. A lot of support and a lot of hate, a lot of anything that a politically questionable activity will give you, you get in a school board. And I got it. And some of my family did too. After I had returned to inactive duty, in the Air Force, and no longer had any affiliation with them, then I was strictly, out in the community.
Honor flight with your family. Can you tell us about that?
Apparently, the honor flight, I was very lucky to have my family who knew a little bit how to, to approach getting on one of those things, worked it out so that I was included on one of the honor flights. You fly up to Washington, D.C. and take in all of the significant monuments and so on and so forth. You're exposed to the company that's the people that are in that particular area, which is impressive in itself, and the way they greet you and treat you. Both of my children, all my children were there to accompany me.
We've heard stories from Pearl Harbor survivors that said that for many decades they didn't talk about their service. They didn't talk about Pearl Harbor. But then when an honor flight came along, they realized that there people were out there that did care about it. Did you feel that way?
I've never seen such cordiality in my life. Parades and fire departments and police accompanying you as escorts and all sorts of things. Bands meeting you. Then to say nothing about the visit to the monuments and so on. And the honor flight was really, really significant to me because they did it up so well planned.
How about that baseball game you were at, the Braves?
My son could probably fill you in better on how it happened, but whatever it was, the Braves decided to make me an honored guest at one of their games on Memorial Day weekend of May 2022, I guess it would have been. I was nearly 100 that year. They featured all of the refreshments. Anything you want practically is yours. And that they expose you down in the field to wheel you down on a red carpet to the field and acknowledge you and have. The nice part with me was I didn't have to make a speech. They made all the speeches, and believe me, there were more than plenty of them. It was a flyover. Yeah.
I understand you spoke to the pilot. What did you guys talk about?
There was no pilot involved. My pilot to the ball game that day was this fellow right here. But are you speaking of the time that I was at New Orleans recently? I was invited to celebrate the Armed Forces Day in New Orleans, which is a big thing down there, very significant. And all of the luminaries from the community are in it. It's well planned. Anyway, on the trip back, Delta Airlines had been informed by somebody that I was on the plane and who I was, and gave a little bit of my background, quite a bit of my background. And by the time I was ready to be on the plane and to fly back to my area here in North Georgia, I had all sorts of acknowledgments and recognition that was given by the Delta people during the flight. And before the flight, after the flight, they couldn't have been any more cordial.
Pearl Harbor commemorations we just had, the last one. Did you watch it online at all?
The only thing I've seen in the form of people that have been involved in ceremonies is just by accident. I've seen a number of aged veterans acknowledged, but as far as Pearl Harbor, the best celebration of Pearl Harbor was the New Orleans one. I'd say probably most comprehensive one, definitely.
You came back to Hawaii to visit Hawaii. What were you?
I came back to Hawaii to visit Hawaii back in 1990, I think it was 1993. My wife and I flew to Oahu, and we stayed. We just took in the beach. We were typical tourists of Honolulu at that time. But I went back to renew old acquaintances with such places as, of course, the Memorial, which I had never actually seen, the Arizona Memorial. So I was able to go back there, and I was well recognized by the welcoming committee from the Pearl Harbor Association there because I was wearing my hat, which they were wearing too.
What were your impressions of the Arizona Memorial?
Very, very complete. They did a good job. They acknowledged some of the plaques in the area, acknowledged people that I had known that had gotten killed. And very, very good. Rented a car, got out to the memorial, and then my wife and I took a car, the same car, and went out to, drove up to Wheeler Field, which at that time was open to the public, believe it or not. And it was an Army helicopter base at that time. But I was able to go into the old barracks of mine, go to the exact place where my bunk was, and see what happened. And I got inside and found out that there was a big construction project taking place in Wheeler Field. And my place was just nothing but a pile of lumber, stacked lumber. But the very place where I slept, where my bunk was, I was able to get to it and see it. But it was being used to store material.
Betsy and Ken, would you guys like to say something about your dad?
Just that we're so proud of him. I mean, that's the bottom line. We absolutely love him, and Ken, you want to?
Well, we just appreciate Dad and all the work he did, because if it wasn't for him and his generation, we wouldn't have what we have today. And he's just always been a rock star in our family and just a great community leader, and I couldn't be prouder.
He's certainly been a mentor and a hero to both of us, I think.
From my point, the opposite is true. There's never a problem.
If you had to give a message to the 85th commemoration coming up, long distance, what would you say to the people who would be assembled there next year?
I'd probably, if it was up to me, I'd have the part of the ceremony or happenings or whatever you want to call them concentrated on the celebration of the affair. The fact that whoever was there lasted that long is alive still, and that people are aware of what resulted from Pearl Harbor. I think a lot more should be concentrated on the what you'd like to have as a takeaway from Pearl Harbor, rather than just the day it happened. That type of thing.
So we also work with a lot of school-age children, and it's an event that happened so long ago that it's hard for them to understand. What would be your message to young students learning about this time in our history?
Become acquainted, if you're not already acquainted, with the lessons of Pearl Harbor, why people should pay attention to the fact that it happened, and what is yielded from what took place, what lessons should be observed, which you should not do and what you should do that came from Pearl Harbor. So it's always be prepared. And when people talk about preparedness, why mean what they say rather than to give it lip service. To talk less in terms of number of airplanes that you build or things like that, and the fact that you know how those are going to be used and what effect they'll have on peaceful outcome, that type of thing.
Taylor and I were looking at a picture of you in Waialae Avenue, which is near where Taylor lived.
Waialae, yeah. Group of friends of mine and I had gone down to Waikiki at that time, and we were walking around. I had the picture taken because I had such a good tan. I tanned very well. And that's why I took that picture, because it shows me well. I have to send it back home to my dad. He got a kick out of it.
There's also a family picture of you with a Marine. Was that your second son?
Yeah, Bill was in training in the Marines, I think.
Michigan fan, I could tell. Is that your team?
Oh, yes, by all means. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Wolverine.
Go Blue, and got a new coach too, right?
Yes, got the Utah coach.
I have that, A Pitiful, Unholy Mess book, just in case you have questions.
That was a well done book. I've read it from cover to cover because I know a lot of the names in there. I mean, they were personal friends of mine. As soon as I saw them, I said, "Oh my gosh!" I had to get out my highlighter, and that book is probably the most highlighted book in the world. And it was all in the last section of the book, last thickness, about like so, because it was where it left Oahu. Ruth and I went back to Maui, and then we we had a visit on the Big Island too, and took in all of the scenery there. I always remember the guide that we had in our bus from Hilo, and he was always concerned that that he had sufficient rest stops. So he always used to say to us, "Well, in another 15 minutes, we'll have a leaky stop." He referred to the places that was the most Hawaiian that I was exposed to. I'll sign off with that. It wouldn't be me if I didn't.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to be of help.